In the middle of the Cold War, Americans believed they were reading free newspapers, watching independent broadcasts, and listening to unbiased voices. What they didn't know was that some of those voices were not entirely their own. Behind newsroom doors and broadcast studios, a quiet operation unfolded. One that did not involve weapons, troops, or battlefields. It involved words. Journalists were recruited. Stories were shaped. Narratives were guided, not always by force, but by access, trust, and silence. This was not propaganda in the way people imagine it. There were no loud slogans. No obvious commands. Instead, there were subtle shifts in emphasis. What to highlight. What to ignore. And when to stay quiet. The program had a name few would hear for decades. And those who participated often believed they were serving a greater good. At the time, the threat felt existential. Ideology itself was seen as a battlefield. So the question was never openly asked. What happens when a democracy quietly interferes with its own flow of information? Because once influence replaces transparency, and secrecy replaces consent, truth becomes harder to recognize, even when it's printed in black and white. Operation Mockingbird did not announce itself. It didn't need to. Its power came from remaining invisible. And long before the public ever learned its name, its impact had already shaped how a nation understood the world. To understand Operation Mockingbird, it is necessary to step back into a world shaped by fear, ideology, and unprecedented global tension. The Second World War had ended, but peace was fragile. Two superpowers emerged with opposing visions of how the world should function. The United States and the Soviet Union were no longer allies, they were rivals in a struggle that extended far beyond military force. This conflict was not always fought with bombs or armies. It was fought through influence. Ideas mattered. Perception mattered. Public opinion became a strategic asset. American officials believed that communism did not need to invade with tanks to win. If minds could be influenced, governments could fall without a single shot being fired. During this period, intelligence agencies expanded their understanding of warfare. Psychological operations, information control, and narrative framing were no longer experimental, they were essential. The Central Intelligence Agency, created in 1947, was tasked with gathering intelligence abroad. But the Cold War blurred boundaries. Foreign influence and domestic stability were seen as inseparable. What Americans believed about the world was considered a matter of national security. At the same time, the media held enormous power. Newspapers shaped daily understanding. Radio delivered voices directly into homes. Television was becoming the most trusted source of information Americans had ever known. Journalists were widely respected. They were seen as independent watchdogs, separate from government influence. Yet the lines between information and influence were not as rigid as the public assumed. In the early Cold War years, relationships quietly formed between intelligence officials and members of the press. Sometimes these relationships were informal. Sometimes they were professional exchanges of access and credibility. Information flowed in both directions. The justification was often framed as patriotic duty. Many believed that cooperation was necessary to counter hostile propaganda from abroad. The Soviet Union invested heavily in state-controlled media. American officials feared falling behind in what they increasingly viewed as an information war. But unlike authoritarian systems, the United States relied on the appearance and promise of a free press. This created a contradiction. How could a democratic society compete in psychological warfare without compromising the very principles it claimed to defend? Rather than confronting that question openly, solutions were developed quietly. Programs were compartmentalized. Oversight was limited. Even within government, few knew the full scope of these efforts. Operation Mockingbird emerged from this environment, not as a single moment or document, but as a network of practices shaped by Cold War urgency. It was not initially designed to deceive Americans outright. At least, not in theory. Instead, it aimed to ensure that certain narratives were amplified while others faded into the background. In an era defined by secrecy, this seemed acceptable to many involved. The assumption was simple. Temporary measures taken in the name of national survival could be justified. What was less considered was how such practices might persist beyond their original purpose, or how deeply they could embed themselves into institutions built on trust. By the time questions began to surface years later, Operation Mockingbird was no longer just a strategy. It had become part of a larger system, one that blurred the line between information and influence in ways the public never consented to. And the most unsettling detail was not that such an operation existed. It was how easily it blended into everyday life. Unnoticed, unchallenged, and largely unquestioned. Operation Mockingbird did not begin with a single order, memo, or public directive. It evolved. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the CIA was still a young institution. Its structure was fluid. Its mandate was broad. And its leadership believed the Cold War demanded unconventional thinking. Traditional intelligence gathering, spies, intercepts, analysis, was no longer enough. Officials began to ask a new question. How could information itself be used as a strategic tool? At the center of this thinking was the belief that public perception could influence international outcomes just as powerfully as military force. If Americans believed the United States was morally strong, unified, and destined to prevail, confidence would follow. If doubt took hold, enemies could exploit it. The press became impossible to ignore. Journalists were everywhere. They moved across borders. They spoke to officials, diplomats, and foreign leaders. They shaped not just headlines, but long-term understanding. Rather than seeing journalists solely as observers, some intelligence officials began viewing them as potential partners. The earliest connections were often informal. A reporter might be briefed off the record. An editor might be offered privileged access. A correspondent might be encouraged to frame a story in a way that aligned with broader national interests. Nothing was written down in clear terms. Plausible deniability was essential. Over time, these relationships became more structured. Certain journalists were considered reliable. Some media outlets were seen as cooperative. Others were quietly avoided. Participation did not always involve deception. In many cases, journalists believed they were protecting national security by withholding sensitive details. The Cold War created moral gray zones. To those involved, the world felt divided between survival and collapse. Nuance seemed like a luxury. By the early 1950s, coordination expanded beyond domestic media. International publications, wire services, and foreign language outlets became part of the strategy. The goal was consistency. A narrative introduced in one country should echo in another. Messages should reinforce one another across borders. This was not censorship in the traditional sense. Stories were rarely banned outright. Instead, emphasis was managed. Certain perspectives received attention. Others quietly disappeared. The operation relied on trust rather than coercion. Journalists were not typically threatened. They were invited. They were told they were helping defend democracy itself. At the same time, oversight remained minimal. Congress was largely uninformed. The public was entirely unaware. Within the intelligence community, information was compartmentalized. Only a small number of officials understood how extensive the relationships had become. And because the operation produced no immediate scandal, it continued. Each successful placement reinforced the belief that the approach worked. Each cooperation normalized the practice further. The press, meant to serve as a check on power, was slowly entangled with it. Yet this entanglement remained invisible. Readers saw articles. Viewers watched broadcasts. Listeners trusted familiar voices. Nothing appeared unusual. And that was precisely the point. Operation Mockingbird was designed not to shock or persuade aggressively. It was designed to blend in, to shape the boundaries of acceptable discourse without drawing attention to itself. By the time it was fully underway, it no longer felt like an experiment. It felt like procedure. And procedures, once established, have a way of continuing long after the circumstances that created them have changed. Silence was not an accident. It was a condition that slowly settled into place. As Operation Mockingbird expanded, it did so in an environment uniquely suited to secrecy. The Cold War rewarded discretion. Questions were often interpreted as disloyalty. Oversight was viewed as an obstacle rather than a safeguard. Within government institutions, compartmentalization became standard practice. Information was divided into fragments. Each fragment was justified on its own terms. Rarely did anyone see the entire structure. This fragmentation created a powerful shield. Officials could claim limited knowledge. Agencies could deny responsibility. And accountability dissolved into ambiguity. Congressional oversight existed in theory, but not in practice. Briefings were selective. Budgets were obscured under national security classifications. Many legislators deferred to intelligence agencies, trusting their judgment during what was described as an existential struggle. The press, which might have questioned this imbalance, was already entangled. Journalists who benefited from access were reluctant to jeopardize it. Editors feared losing sources. Networks feared appearing unpatriotic. Self-censorship required no direct instruction. Stories that raised uncomfortable questions were delayed. Investigations stalled. Concerns were reframed as speculative or irresponsible. Over time, silence became institutional. Inside the CIA, Mockingbird-related activities were treated as routine. They were embedded within broader information and influence programs. Few felt the need to question their legitimacy. The absence of visible harm reinforced complacency. There were no immediate public scandals. No dramatic confrontations. No obvious victims. Instead, there was a gradual erosion of boundaries. What began as selective cooperation evolved into normalized coordination. The distinction between independent reporting and guided messaging blurred further with each passing year. The systemic failure was not rooted in malice alone. It was driven by incentives. Officials were rewarded for effectiveness, not transparency. Journalists were rewarded for access, not skepticism. Institutions protected themselves by avoiding scrutiny. Ethical concerns were often deferred to the future. The assumption was that extraordinary measures were temporary. That once the Cold War ended, normal standards would return. But temporary systems have a tendency to persist. Silence also thrived because responsibility was dispersed. No single person could be held accountable. No single document revealed the whole truth. No single decision could be isolated as the point of failure. Each participant could justify their role as minor, necessary, or unavoidable. This diffusion of responsibility made dissent rare. Those who questioned the arrangement faced professional risks. They could be excluded from briefings, labeled as unreliable, or quietly marginalized. In such an environment, silence was safer than inquiry. Even within media organizations, internal discussions were muted. Young reporters learned quickly which topics advanced careers, and which stalled them. Editorial lines hardened without being written down. Unspoken rules replaced formal directives. The public, meanwhile, remained unaware. They consumed information assuming it was independent. They trusted institutions designed to inform them honestly. They believed the separation between government power and journalistic integrity remained intact. This belief was the system's greatest protection. Operation Mockingbird did not require force. It relied on assumption. The assumption that democratic institutions would self-correct. That ethical lines would reassert themselves naturally. But systems do not correct themselves without pressure. And pressure requires visibility. By the time cracks began to form, the operation was deeply embedded within multiple layers of governance and media. Silence had become not just a condition, but a feature. A feature that protected careers, preserved influence, and avoided confrontation. And as long as silence held, the system functioned exactly as designed. The most powerful effects of Operation Mockingbird were not immediate. They unfolded slowly, quietly, and often invisibly. By the time the operation had matured, its influence extended far beyond individual stories or isolated narratives. It had reshaped expectations about journalism, authority, and truth itself. One of the earliest consequences was subtle normalization. Audiences grew accustomed to a certain tone in reporting. Government perspectives were treated as default frameworks. Official explanations were rarely challenged with sustained skepticism. This did not feel imposed. It felt natural. Over time, this familiarity altered how dissent was perceived. Critical voices were framed as fringe. Alternative interpretations were labeled speculative. Questioning official narratives became associated with instability rather than civic responsibility. The result was not uniform agreement, but narrowed debate. Within media institutions, habits solidified. Editors learned which stories traveled easily and which stalled. Producers learned how to frame complex issues without triggering institutional resistance. Journalists learned to anticipate invisible boundaries. These boundaries were rarely discussed openly. They did not need to be. The long shadow also reached journalism education. New generations of reporters were trained within systems already shaped by decades of influence. They inherited norms without knowing their origins. Practices once considered exceptional became standard. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies internalized the success of information management. If influence could be exercised quietly through media relationships, why abandon the approach? Even as specific programs ended or evolved, the underlying logic remained intact. Information was not just something to protect, it was something to shape. This logic carried forward into new technologies. Television expanded reach. Satellite broadcasting accelerated global dissemination. Later, digital platforms multiplied audiences beyond anything Cold War planners could have imagined. The mechanisms changed. The mindset endured. Public trust was also affected, but not immediately. Trust does not collapse all at once. It erodes. Small inconsistencies accumulate. Contradictions surface. Confidence weakens without a clear point of rupture. When later scandals emerged, unrelated on the surface, citizens increasingly questioned official accounts. Not because they understood Mockingbird, but because they sensed a pattern. Something felt managed. This suspicion did not always lead to clarity. In many cases, it led to cynicism. When people believe information is manipulated, they may stop seeking truth altogether. They retreat into skepticism or apathy. This outcome was never publicly acknowledged, but it became one of the operation's most lasting consequences. A society uncertain about its sources becomes vulnerable in new ways. The long shadow also affected democratic accountability. If the press is compromised, even partially, its ability to check power weakens. Abuses become harder to expose. Errors persist longer. And because the system operated without visible force, correcting it proved difficult. There was no single policy to repeal. No clear structure to dismantle. Only habits, incentives, and relationships. By the time awareness began to surface, the operation's influence had already diffused. It existed less as a program and more as a legacy. A legacy embedded in professional norms. In institutional memory. In unspoken assumptions about how information should flow. The most troubling aspect of this legacy was its ambiguity. Many who participated believed they had acted responsibly. Some believed they had protected democracy. Others believed they had simply done their jobs. This moral uncertainty prevented closure. Without clear reckoning, the past lingered unresolved. And unresolved systems tend to repeat themselves. Under new names, new technologies, and new justifications. The long shadow of Operation Mockingbird was not defined by what it did in secrecy, but by what it quietly changed forever. Exposure did not arrive with a single headline. It arrived in fragments. For years, Operation Mockingbird remained shielded by classification, silence, and disbelief. Even when rumors circulated, they were often dismissed as exaggeration or paranoia. The first cracks appeared not through official channels, but through persistence. Investigative journalists began noticing patterns that did not align with coincidence. Identical narratives surfaced across competing outlets. Editorial positions shifted in unison without public explanation. Certain topics attracted immediate pushback, others complete avoidance. These inconsistencies raised quiet questions. Initially, they were discussed privately. Among reporters, among editors, among academics studying media behavior. What they found was not proof, but alignment. The breakthrough came as broader skepticism toward government secrecy began to grow. The late Cold War era brought increased scrutiny of intelligence agencies. Public confidence had already been shaken by unrelated disclosures involving surveillance, covert operations, and political manipulation. Against this backdrop, earlier rumors about media influence resurfaced with renewed urgency. Congressional inquiries slowly widened their scope. Committees tasked with reviewing intelligence activities encountered references that did not fit conventional explanations. Budget lines without clear purpose. Communications that suggested informal coordination. Language that implied influence rather than observation. Still, resistance was strong. Agencies invoked national security. Documents were heavily redacted. Witnesses were cautious, measured, and often vague. The exposure process was deliberate, almost reluctant. When details finally emerged, they did so without dramatic flourish. There were no explosive revelations presented to the public in a single moment. Instead, acknowledgement came through reports, testimony, and carefully worded statements. The picture that formed was incomplete, but unmistakable. Media organizations were named not as conspirators, but as participants in informal arrangements. Influence was framed as cooperation. Coordination as patriotism. This framing softened the impact, but did not erase it. Public reaction was conflicted. Some viewed the revelations as confirmation of long-held suspicions. Others struggled to reconcile them with their trust in democratic institutions. Many were unsure what to believe. Unlike scandals with clear villains, this exposure lacked emotional clarity. There were no visible crimes, no dramatic arrests, no immediate consequences. Instead, there was discomfort. Citizens questioned how long influence had operated, how deeply it had penetrated, and whether it had truly ended. Media coverage of the exposure was cautious, sometimes defensive. Some outlets minimized the findings. Others emphasized historical context to distance themselves from responsibility. A few addressed the issue directly, acknowledging ethical failures without detailing specifics. This uneven response further complicated public understanding. Trust, once weakened, proved difficult to restore. The revelation that respected institutions had quietly cooperated with intelligence objectives unsettled many viewers and readers. Not because they expected perfection, but because they had expected independence. For younger generations, the story arrived differently. They encountered it as historical footnote rather than lived experience, as something that belonged to another era. But for those who lived through it, the realization was personal. They remembered broadcasts, headlines, narratives they had accepted without question. Now, those memories carried uncertainty. The exposure also triggered professional reckoning within journalism. Codes of ethics were revisited. Discussions about independence grew louder. Barriers between reporters and intelligence agencies were formally reinforced. But reforms could not undo the past. They could only respond to it. The most significant reaction, however, occurred beneath the surface. A lasting skepticism took hold. Citizens became more critical of official narratives. Media literacy gained importance. Questions once dismissed as unpatriotic were reframed as necessary. This shift did not lead to consensus. It led to fragmentation. Some demanded transparency. Others rejected institutions entirely. A few retreated into distrust of all information sources. Exposure, while essential, came with unintended consequences. It revealed not just a program, but a vulnerability. A vulnerability in how power communicates, in how trust is constructed, and in how easily influence can operate without visible force. Operation Mockingbird was no longer secret, but its impact on public perception was far from resolved. After exposure came reflection, but not resolution. The acknowledgement of Operation Mockingbird forced institutions to respond, even if reluctantly. Intelligence agencies, media organizations, and lawmakers each faced a different kind of reckoning. None could fully undo what had already occurred. The most visible changes emerged within government oversight. Congress expanded its review mechanisms. Intelligence committees were strengthened. Reporting requirements became more formalized. The intent was clear: prevent informal influence from operating beyond scrutiny. Yet these reforms focused on structure, not culture. Rules could be written. Procedures could be revised. But the habits formed over decades were not easily erased. Within intelligence agencies, information operations were reframed. Language shifted. Programs were described in more technical terms. Influence became strategic communication. Coordination became public affairs. The goals appeared more transparent, but the logic remained familiar. Information was still considered a domain of power. Media institutions also responded, though unevenly. Ethics policies were updated. Disclosure standards were clarified. Formal barriers between journalists and intelligence agencies were emphasized. But enforcement varied. Some organizations embraced reform openly. Others treated it as a reputational exercise. The legacy relationships did not vanish overnight. In many cases, they evolved quietly. Professional distance increased, but access remained valuable. Sources remained influential. And incentives still shaped behavior. Journalism schools began addressing the issue more directly. Students were taught about conflicts of interest, about the dangers of proximity to power, about the importance of skepticism. Yet these lessons often arrived abstracted from their historical roots. Operation Mockingbird became a case study, not a lived warning. For the public, the aftermath was ambiguous. There was no single apology, no formal admission of wrongdoing at scale, no clear declaration that such practices had fully ended. Instead, there were assurances. Assurances that oversight had improved, that boundaries were respected, that the past was not the present. Some accepted these reassurances. Others remained doubtful. Trust, once shaken, does not return through statements alone. The changes also revealed limits of accountability. No major legal consequences followed. No sweeping institutional purges occurred. Responsibility was diffuse. Blame was historical. This lack of consequence frustrated critics but reassured insiders. It reinforced a quiet lesson. Systems can change without reckoning. Perhaps the most significant shift occurred in public awareness. Citizens became more attentive to how narratives were framed. Media consumption grew more critical. The idea that information could be influenced, even in democracies, entered mainstream understanding. This awareness was not uniform. Some reacted with caution and curiosity. Others with cynicism and disengagement. But the illusion of absolute independence had been broken. Technological change complicated the aftermath further. As traditional media declined, new platforms rose. Control decentralized. Influence fragmented. This created new challenges. Without centralized institutions, oversight became harder. Influence became less visible, but more pervasive. The lessons of Mockingbird did not disappear. They were repurposed. Governments, corporations, and interest groups all studied information dynamics. Not always to inform, but to persuade. The aftermath revealed an uncomfortable truth. Operation Mockingbird was not an anomaly. It was an early example. An example of how power adapts to communication systems. How influence follows attention. And how ethical lines blur when stakes are framed as existential. Reforms mattered, but they were incomplete. They addressed the visible structure, not the underlying temptation. The question that lingered was not whether Mockingbird would happen again, but whether societies had learned how to recognize it in time. Operation Mockingbird belongs to the past, but its implications do not. What made the operation effective was not secrecy alone. It was timing. It emerged at a moment when mass media was centralized, trusted, and scarce. A handful of institutions shaped national understanding. Influencing them meant influencing the public. Today, the media landscape looks different, but the underlying challenge remains. Information has multiplied. Platforms have fragmented. Voices compete rather than converge. Yet influence has not disappeared. It has adapted. Modern audiences encounter news through algorithms, curated feeds, and personalized streams. The question is no longer who controls the newsroom, but who controls visibility. In this environment, the lessons of Mockingbird feel unexpectedly relevant. The operation demonstrated how easily narratives could be shaped without overt censorship. No headlines were banned. No broadcasts were silenced. Instead, emphasis shifted. Context narrowed. Certain perspectives became dominant by design. These techniques did not require force, only coordination. Modern information systems operate on similar principles, though at greater speed. Content rises or falls based on engagement metrics. Complex issues are compressed into fragments. Nuance competes with immediacy. This creates new vulnerabilities. Influence no longer depends on formal relationships. It depends on amplification. While intelligence agencies today operate under stricter oversight, information strategies remain central to national power. Governments communicate strategically. Institutions manage perception. Narratives are tested, refined, and repeated. The difference is visibility, not intent. Public awareness has grown, but so has confusion. The legacy of Mockingbird complicates trust in modern media. When people know influence once operated in secrecy, they may assume it always does. This assumption can be corrosive. Healthy skepticism becomes blanket disbelief. Critical thinking gives way to disengagement. Democracy relies on informed citizens, not just informed institutions. This tension defines the modern relevance of the story. The lesson is not that all information is manipulated, nor that institutions are inherently deceptive. The lesson is that transparency matters, and must be defended continuously. Operation Mockingbird thrived because oversight lagged behind innovation. Power adapted faster than accountability. That pattern is not unique to the Cold War. Technology evolves. Institutions respond. Ethics often arrive last. In recent years, debates over misinformation, state influence, and media independence echo earlier concerns. The language has changed. The platforms have changed. But the core question remains. Who shapes the story, and why? For journalists, the relevance is professional. Independence must be practiced, not assumed. Distance from power must be maintained deliberately. For audiences, the relevance is civic. Media literacy is no longer optional. Understanding how narratives form is essential to participation. And for institutions, the relevance is moral. Influence exercised quietly may feel effective in the short term, but costly in the long run. Trust, once lost, is difficult to restore. Operation Mockingbird reminds us that democratic systems are not only threatened by external forces. They are tested internally by how power communicates with the public it claims to serve. The past does not repeat itself exactly, but its patterns endure. And recognizing those patterns may be the only way to prevent them from returning. Under new names, new technologies, and familiar justifications. Operation Mockingbird did not end with a dramatic collapse. It faded quietly. There was no single moment when the public was told, "This is over." No clear line separating what had been from what would never happen again. Instead, the program receded into archives, footnotes, and cautious acknowledgments. But silence does not equal absence. The true legacy of Operation Mockingbird lies not in what it controlled, but in what it revealed. It showed how influence can operate without force, how trust can be guided rather than broken, and how democratic systems can be shaped quietly while appearing unchanged. This was not a story of villains and shadows. It was a story of incentives, fear, and justification. Those involved often believed they were acting in the nation's best interest. They framed influence as protection, coordination as necessity. And that framing mattered. Because once influence is justified by urgency, limits become flexible. The program also revealed a deeper truth about power and communication. Control does not require ownership. It requires access. When narratives are shaped indirectly, responsibility becomes blurred. Accountability diffuses. And ethical boundaries soften. For the public, the cost was subtle. There was no single false headline that defined the era. No obvious moment of deception. Instead, there was omission, emphasis, perspective. The absence of alternative voices mattered as much as the presence of approved ones. Operation Mockingbird reminds us that freedom of the press is not only about what is printed, but about what is possible to print. It is about independence that must be protected, even from those who claim to defend it. The story also challenges a comforting assumption: that democracies are immune to manipulation. They are not. They are resilient, but only when vigilance exists on both sides of power, within institutions, and among citizens. History does not ask us to reject authority outright. It asks us to question it responsibly. To understand that transparency is not a guarantee, it is a practice. And that trust must be earned continuously, not inherited. Operation Mockingbird is no longer active by name, but its lesson remains active. Every era has its tools. Every system its temptations. Every generation its test. The question is not whether influence will be attempted. The question is whether it will be recognized. And whether societies will choose awareness over comfort. Even when the truth is quiet, complex, and inconvenient.
Thank you for watching.